Hello, welcome back to the fourth episode of Raising the Bar. This is Shaynna, and today I'm joined by two lower six students who take history A-level because we're going to discuss the Nuremberg Trials and we wanted expertise. So they're going to introduce themselves now.
Hello, I'm James.
Hello, my name's Mark.
And we're just going to discuss the Nuremberg Trials. They've organised a series of questions to discuss. So yeah, just over to you.
So to start off with, what were the Nuremberg Trials? Well, the Nuremberg Trials were a series of military tribunals held between 1945 and 46 to prosecute the top Nazi officials for the war crimes they committed. And this was a groundbreaking effort to bring justice for the atrocities of World War II.
Who were the main defendants and what were they accused of?
So the Nuremberg trials targeted most, if not all, the high-ranking Nazi officials following World War II. Most of the defendants were accused of crimes against peace, war crimes, and just general human rights violations. So most top defendants that were prosecuted were the main and successors of Hitler. Hermann Göring was Hitler's designated successor in case he died and the head of the German Air Force. He was accused of initiating aggressive war, overseeing forced labour and looting occupied territories. Rudolf Hess, for example, he was Hitler's deputy Führer until he fled to Britain in 1841, following after he saw sort of defeating or stagnation within the German attack. He was also accused of helping planning aggressive wars and spreading Nazi ideology. There were multiple cases of this. Most people did end up either getting sentenced to death or sentenced to life imprisonment.
What were the key charges brought against the Nazi leaders?
There were many charges brought up against the Nazi leaders, including crimes against peace, war crimes in particular to do with the Holocaust, but as well as the genocide of many different ethnic groups, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy to commit these crimes. Unfortunately, lots of these key leaders killed themselves, well, only 3, killed themselves before the trial, so you could argue justice wasn't fully upheld for these horrible atrocities. Moving on to question 4.
How did the Nuremberg trials help establish the principles of international law?
So Nuremberg trial was sort of codified and sort of new legal principles that have never been enforced prior, especially on human rights aspect. So the first way in which the Nuremberg trial sort of established international law was by enforcing accountability for individuals for war crimes. So it established that individuals, including heads of state, military leaders, and personnel, could be held accountable for crimes like genocide, war crime, and crimes against humanity, which weren't previously enforced. It also finally defined crimes against humanity. So the concepts such as genocide, enslavement, and mass persecution were first legally articulated during the Nuremberg trials, and they've since been used in international courts like those in Rwanda and Yugoslavia. It also rejected the just follow orders as a defense in prosecution in international courts. And the Nuremberg trials made it clear that obedience to superior orders did not excuse them from war crimes, and it was later codified. And this sort of principle was later codified in the Geneva Conventions later on in the century.
Okay, thank you. Were the trials fair to the defendants? Why or why not?
Well, I would make the argument that they were fair, as there was legal representation on both sides and they both happened with due process. However, some critics of this claim that they were quote-unquote victors' justice, as only Axis powers were prosecuted, when many argue that Allied forces also committed some atrocities that needed to be prosecuted. So we need to look at both sides, but I think it's quite fair to say that the Axis powers were fairly prosecuted for the crimes they committed. Now on to question 6.
How did the trials deal with the defence of just following orders?
Well, one of the most significant and ethical issues during the Nuremberg was that the defence of superior orders was the main claim that defendants of the defendants, and the tribunal firmly rejected this argument, and it set an important precedent for future laws. So the tribunal ruled that obeying an illegal order does not absolve responsibility, and if the individual had the moral or legal capacity to resist, then he should have. The judges within the trial stated that individuals have a duty to refuse participation in atrocities, even in hierarchical military structures, like Nazi Germany.
Okay, thank you. What challenges did prosecutors face in proving crimes like genocide and crimes against humanity?
Well, since many of these crimes were committed under state orders, proving individual responsibility was very difficult, and evidence included eyewitness testimonies, Nazi documents, and film footage of concentration camps. Ultimately, none of the evidence was seen to be inconclusive by the judges, so I would come to the conclusion that prosecutors may have had difficulties at first, but when the evidence was fully proposed and the understanding of the atrocities that were committed, they came to the right conclusions and the evidence that they needed was there.
Thanks. Do you think that the sentences handed down were appropriate? Why or why not?
Well, not the Nazi German officials were accused of committing quite vast crimes. I mean, the Holocaust, forced labour and aggressive war that resulted in tens of millions of deaths sort of saw death penalties and largely appropriate crimes and penalties for that. I mean, of course, top Nazi officials were prosecuted, and it did set global precedent that crimes against humanity would not go unpunished, and death penalties and life in prison were enforced.
How did the Nuremberg trials influence later war crimes trials, such as those for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia?
Well, the original trials in Nuremberg set precedents used in modern tribunals like the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, which investigated the Rwandan genocide, and the former Yugoslavia International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia as well. These went into war crimes and human rights crimes that followed the precedents set at the Nuremberg trials. So it had a major influence over future human rights trials.
Okay, thank you. In what ways did the trials contribute to the development of human rights and international justice?
Well, Nuremberg trials were a sort of turning point for human rights and international justice. I mean, they've influenced most legal frameworks that still exist today regarding human rights and unjust war. So it firstly established crimes against humanity and genocide, and it formally recognised genocide and crimes against humanity as an offence under international law, which sort of underpinned the 1948 Genocide Convention, which criminalised genocide worldwide. Human rights were also heavily enforced after this, and it saw the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, also in 1948, and that's emphasised individuals' rights and just the protection against state oppression so that nothing like Nazi Germany happened again. A question that a lot of people have is, was it fair to prosecute Nazi Germany leaders under laws that did not exist when their crimes were committed? And that's one of the strongest criticisms of the Nuremberg trials, was that they violated the principle of no crime without law. This principle, fundamental to due process, holds that a person cannot be convicted of a crime unless it was clearly defined in a law before the act was committed. And that's quite a concern of pro-Nazis in even modern day, but as quite a argument against the fairness of the trials. The crimes also against humanity were not enforced until after World War II, so there was potential openness to corruption on the charges, and yeah.
Right, a final conclusion for our little podcast. The Nuremberg Trials were a landmark moment in history. They set a precedent for international justice and shaped modern human rights laws by holding Nazi leaders accountable for crimes against humanity. They reinforced the principles that individuals, regardless of rank, could not escape justice by claiming they were, quote-unquote, just following orders. And these trials also laid the foundation for future war crime prosecutions, influencing the tribunals for conflicts in Rwanda, Yugoslavia, and beyond. Their legacy continues today, reminding the world of the importance of accountability. The trials did contain elements of retroactive law, particularly in the prosecution of crimes against humanity and crimes against peace. However, the severity and scale of Nazi crimes made it imperative to establish legal accountability, while some aspects may have conflicted with the traditional legal principles. The trials laid the foundation for modern international criminal law, ensuring that such atrocities could never again be committed without legal consequence.
Okay, thank you so much to Mark and to James for joining us today for this podcast episode. It was very informative and detailed, and thank you all for listening.